Snow fell in thick waves that turned sound into a dull hush. The mountains held the cold like a locked room, and the wind carried it across the compound until breath felt like a thin wire. Buildings sat low and gray against the drift, functional and without romance. This was a United States Navy SEAL cold weather facility at roughly 8,000 feet in mid-February, where nothing moved unless it served a purpose. Avery Cole stood near the painted boundary of the training yard and did not move. She wore standard cold weather layers with no unit patch and no name tape. Her rifle rested at low ready, muzzle down, finger indexed high on the frame. Safety on. The stance was quiet and correct, the kind learned by repetition rather than display. Range flags snapped, then settled. As the tower called, range cold. A pair of range safety petty officers walked past and glanced at the muzzle, then at the line, then away. Satisfied. The snow hissed along the asphalt and made a lace of frost on boot prints before the prints could sink. Stillness sat on her shoulders like another garment, and she carried it without tension. From the access road, a convoy eased through the gate and rolled to the headquarters building. Admiral Bennett Shaw stepped down from the lead vehicle, collar up against the gusts, the kind of presence that made motion around him narrow and sharpen. At his shoulder moved Lieutenant Noah Price, tablet tucked inside his jacket, eyes busy even in the cold. This was a scheduled readiness review, not a show, and the Admiral's pace made that clear. Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney met them at the steps with a brief nod and a steady look. He ran base operations today, and the weight of that job showed in the way he kept his words small and his movements exact. He walked the Admiral toward the entry, and a heater glow spilled across their boots. As they passed the yard, Delaney's gaze paused for half a second on the still figure at the boundary, then returned to the job. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh stood under the overhang outside the armory with a paper cup that steamed and went cold fast. He watched the woman in the yard with the bored suspicion of a sailor who has seen tricks before. In the armory window, someone said she was just a contractor. Another voice said she was not a shooter. The words were not cruel, only easy. Shaw crossed to the yard before the door took him inside. He saw the rifle first. The stock was not Navy property and did not wear a stencil. The grain showed long use and careful care, the kind that builds a shine where a cheek settles and where a sling rubs through long miles. The Admiral's eye caught a mark near the butt. It was small and cut by hand. 3 short lines that met and held to each other without flourish. The mark had been pressed with oil and time and looked newer than the rest of the wood, which made it stand out in the flat light. Shaw's face did not shift much, but the set of his shoulders changed by a degree that a trained watcher could feel. Inside the building, a petty officer held the door while the Admiral entered. He called out a quick reminder for chamber clear checks, and a brief range cold confirmation moved across the net with clipped replies. Forms of address were even and correct. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander, Chief, Lieutenant, the rhythm of a place that runs on rolls more than on names. Delaney briefed in the corner office with a topo map pinned under glass. The talk was simple. Weather, training throughput, logistics, medical, and communications. Lieutenant Price kept time of arrivals and departures and logged who owed whom a follow-up. The Tactical Operations Center sat 2 doors down and hummed in a way that never rose above a murmur. The rule was not posted on paper because it did not need to be. No one acts outside tasking from the Tactical Operations Center. Contractors do not intervene. Outside, range hot came back and steel clanged far down the lanes. Cole did not cross the painted line. She watched the flag, watched the wind move low along the ground, and blinked only when the gusts sent needles of ice across her face. The rifle never drifted. The sling sat just tight enough to anchor the weight without pulling her off balance. Walsh stepped out from the armory and walked past. eyes on the lane, then on the muzzle, then on the line. He looked at her boots to see if the toes edged the paint, and they did not. He let the silence run, then moved on. In places like this, silence said more than speech. The parking lot filled and emptied as small tasks met their time windows. A forklift hissed by with a pallet of target frames, and a corpsman carried a box of chemical warmers to the aid station. A watchstander at the entry checked IDs with a brief nod that never changed. The compound worked around the weather and inside the rules. It looked ordinary because it was exact. A cold gust cut across the yard and pushed the sling against Cole's sleeve. She adjusted a half-inch at the buckle and rechecked the safety with a thumb press and a feel rather than a look. The action mattered more than the show. When she moved to the doorway later, she would lock the bolt to the rear and show chamber clear by habit before a range safety petty officer could even ask. In the office, Delaney closed the brief with a clean summary and handed the Admiral a short list for signatures. The aide kept the list in view and whispered a gentle reminder about a teleconference at 2:30 p.m. Shaw signed, handed the pen back, and turned toward the door. His route shifted an inch, so the path would carry him past the boundary line again. The Admiral paused near the paint and took in the posture that had not changed. He saw the indexed finger, the muzzle down, the control of weight on the balls of the feet. He looked again at the stock and the three-line cut that lived near the butt. He did not ask about it. He did not need to. He filed the detail the way a pilot files an odd wind report, not as gossip but as a variable. Snow raked the yard and then softened again. A range tower called a reset on targets, and the metallic clack came thin through the air. Cole shifted her weight in a slow cycle to keep blood in the feet and then settled. Her breath made small clouds that collapsed and disappeared. There was no dramatics in any part of it. Only the repeated choices of a person who keeps the smallest promises. A pair of junior sailors walked by and used the word contractor the way people use the word furniture. Walsh came around the corner in time to hear it and did not add anything. He had learned that talk did not change outcomes. He looked at the rifle again, at the way the sling wore shiny at one edge, and the screws on the scope base showed a faint witness mark from a torque wrench. He was a skeptic by habit, and habit made him thorough. Delaney stepped back into the wind with the Admiral at his side and briefed the rest of the day in a low voice that carried only as far as it needed to. He kept the Tactical Operations Center as the center of gravity. Any training deviation would run through that room, through the watch officer, through the log. No one freelanced. No one grabbed a lane. It kept people alive, and it kept reports clean. Price fell in beside them and made a note on the tablet. He had a way of seeing small things that mattered and leaving small things that did not. He glanced once toward the yard and then back to the schedule. He did not know what the hand-cut mark meant and did not pretend to. He knew the rule, and the rule kept the day from drifting. The sky pressed low, then broke to a lighter gray that showed another line of weather building over the ridge. A truck engine coughed and settled, and the scent of diesel drifted across the lot. The net carried a short burst as the tower corrected a call, and then it went quiet again. The quiet was not empty. It was disciplined. Cole rolled one shoulder and let it drop back into position. The rifle stayed steady at low ready. She watched the wind curl under the flag and the way the snow stacked along the base of the fence. She did not need to be anywhere else. The boundary line did not need a sign to hold her. It held because it was the rule. Shaw nodded once to Delaney and walked on. He had seen enough to know what the facility had in it and what it did not. He had seen the small things that tell a story in this kind of place. He did not speak them out loud because they were not his to speak. He carried them the way he carried other quiet facts that keep people safe. Inside the doorway, a range safety petty officer held up a hand, and a Marine in a watch cap locked a bolt to the rear and showed a clear chamber. The check took a breath, and then they were through. The building felt warm by comparison. Steam rose off jackets and vanished into the ceiling air. The hall smelled faintly of oil and coffee and wool that had seen weather. The yard went on breathing in that slow winter way that makes seconds feel long and sharp. Cole's eyes moved the way a clock hand moves. Steady and patient. Somewhere behind the clouds, a patch of light made the snow look blue rather than white. The 3 lines on the stock took that light for a moment and let it go. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander, Chief, and Lieutenant moved through the day, and the compound followed their cadence. The Tactical Operations Center kept the net clean and the logs tidy. The rule at the heart of the place stayed simple and firm. No one acts outside tasking from the Tactical Operations Center. Contractors do not intervene. By late morning, the wind set into a pattern that felt like a long run rather than a sprint. The yard settled into its work. Cole held her ground with the same steady posture she had used since the first minute. She did not invite notice and did not avoid it. She let the discipline do the talking. When the tower called, "Range cold again," she eased the rifle higher on the sling and stepped toward the door with the rest. The motion had no hurry. At the threshold, she locked the bolt to the rear and touched the chamber face with a glance and with a practiced feel. Then entered. The small things stayed in order. The big things waited their turn. In the afternoon, the schedule would turn its pages one after another. Inspections would finish. A short meeting would settle a question about training throughput. Price would check times and send the right notes. Delaney would walk the floor of the Tactical Operations Center and keep the hum at a proper level. Shaw would observe and decide without drawing attention to the decisions. The snow would keep falling in measured sheets, and the wind would keep pulling it back up again. At the yard line, someone would say she is only a contractor, and then forget the words as soon as they left. Walsh would turn back once, and look at the 3 lines cut into the stock, and tuck away the image without comment. The day would move on and the rules would hold. In places like this, tension does not announce itself with big gestures. It arrives as a quiet knowing that something more may be required. The compound had that feeling in its bones as the light began to thin. Avery Cole stood where she had been told to stand and kept the smallest promises. The rest waited out there in the gray, just past the line. Snow ran across the yard in thin sheets that made a soft hiss against the concrete. Avery Cole stood just inside the painted boundary where the wind curled and settled. She kept the rifle at low ready with the muzzle down and the safety on. Her finger stayed indexed along the receiver and never drifted toward the trigger. Range flags shifted in the gusts as the tower called range hot. Then range cold. Then hot again. Avery did not cross the line. She worked the sling tighter with a small pull and checked that the webbing lay flat against her coat. Nothing snagged. Nothing rattled. Nothing flashed in the light. The rifle was an Accuracy International AXMC, chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum with a mounted suppressor. A Schmidt & Bender 5-25 power day optic sat low over the action. A Trijicon Snipe IR clip on thermal rode forward on the rail when she needed it and stayed in a protective sleeve when she did not. She tested the bolt slowly until it felt like a polished joint. She moved through a quiet loop that looked like routine and was more than routine. With a gloved thumb and forefinger, she verified the torque on each optic ring by touch and felt for the faint give. That means trouble. The bipod cant lock turned under her hand and stopped with a firm seat. She gave the forend a slight twist to confirm nothing shifted under pressure. Magazines waited in a pouch where she could reach them without looking. She tapped each base plate to seat rounds against the rear and counted by feel. The motion was careful and unhurried. The way a pilot checks a latch before a long flight. A moment later, she eased a magazine home and confirmed positive lock with a tug. Before stepping anywhere near a doorway, she locked the bolt to the rear and ran a chamber clear check. The light was bad in the blowing snow, so she used touch more than sight. Satisfy the hand first and the eye second. When the tower called range hot again, she let the bolt forward on an empty chamber and returned to low ready. She opened a Kestrel 5700 and woke the applied ballistics profile with a short hold. The screen showed a 14-knot quartering crosswind with gusts near 20 knots. Temperature and pressure gave her a density altitude around 6,700 feet. She saved a 950-meter firing solution for a 250-grain match round with a G7 ballistic coefficient, and then stored 2 alternate wind brackets. The yard around her kept working in small circles. She ranged a ridge cut and a tall pine with a Vectronics PLRF-15C laser, and built a mental map from those fixed points. She played the distances back once more, and matched them against the topo lines she had seen earlier. The numbers settled into place until they felt less like digits and more like shapes. The clip-on thermal came out of the sleeve and clicked onto the forward rail. She aligned it to the day optic and confirmed that the reticle stayed true. A slow, dry press checked for wander and showed none. She logged a quick note to herself, because memory is strong and notes are stronger. Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney crossed the lot with his collar up and his face set against the wind. He watched her run the checks with a straight mouth and an extra second at the optic mounts. The thought passed through his head that this level of care was overkill for a routine training day. He kept walking because the Tactical Operations Center needed him more than his opinion did. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh drifted near the armory door and took his time with the scene. He watched her breath slow in clear steps until the clouds off her mouth came farther apart. He watched her shoulders drop a fraction and hold. It looked like a switch that set the heart to a steady beat and left it there. Avery never looked toward the observers. She kept her eyes on the wind and the ground, and the small tells that show what the sky will do next. The suppressor was snug and showed no carbon halo at the joint. The crown was clean and the threads were free of frost. She left nothing to chance that could be removed by care. Range etiquette held steady across the yard. The tower owned the word when it called range hot or range cold. Avery echoed the rule by action more than speech. Muzzle down. Safety on. Finger indexed. And no movement across the paint without tasking from inside the Tactical Operations Center. She heard Admiral Bennett Shaw move past with Lieutenant Noah Price a few minutes later. The forms of address stayed clean even in the cold. Admiral. Lieutenant Commander. Chief. The sound of those words marked a boundary as clearly as the paint on the ground. The wind shifted and curled low. So she updated the Kestrel and watched the quartering value change by a notch. She logged the new hold and saved a second bracket for gusts near 20 knots since gusts do not ask permission. She reviewed the 950-meter solution for the 250-grain round once more and pictured the travel through air, that thin. The act made the math settle into muscle. Her breathing fell into a simple pattern that left room for thought. In for a slow count. Hold just enough to settle the reticle in her mind. Out until the chest was light again. Each pass stripped noise off the nerves and left only the small signals that matter on a cold day. When she moved, the motion was so slight, the sling hardly noticed. Walsh watched 5 seconds longer and told himself the habits were fine for a squad match, but heavy for a Tuesday. He did not say it out loud because there was nothing to add. Delaney had already gone inside to manage the net and the log. The yard kept its pace and let the work speak for itself. Avery lifted the rifle a notch and checked the snipe IR alignment again. She wanted the impact point to match the day glass. Not almost match. The reticle and the thermal image lined up and stayed lined when she pressed through the trigger wall on a dry check. It took more time to verify than it would have taken to ignore. Which is why it mattered. She ran her hand along the stock to feel for chips or edges that catch in snow gear. The stock was contractor owned and carried the wear of miles, not months. Near the butt, a small cut lived in the wood where the finish had darkened. 3 short lines crossed and held. Simple and without noise. The light pushed through a thin spot in the clouds and struck the mark. It showed for a second, and then the sky closed again. No one nearby asked about it. The moment moved on and left its small echo in the quiet. A cart hissed by with cardboard targets, and a corpsman walked a bundle of blankets toward the aid station. The tower corrected a call, and the yard answered with clear voices. Avery tucked the Kestrel back into a pocket where the battery would stay warm enough to matter. The little computer would be there when the weather asked for it again. She sat in the posture that keeps heat where it belongs and attention where it must be. The bolt cycled once more under her hand and felt like a polished hinge. Metal, glass, and polymer all agreed with each other. Everything else could change and the tools would still be ready. The breath count fell and rose with the same steady pattern. Her heart settled into a slow rhythm that kept hands calm and eyes steady. She did not think about shooting. She thought about being able to shoot without fighting her own body when the order came. Across the lot, Delaney paused at the door and let his eye pass over the scene. He registered the sling tension, the clean checks, the restraint. The thought that this was overkill crossed his mind again and left without a mark. He opened the door and went back to work. Walsh turned once more to the yard and watched the last sunlight struggle against the weather. He saw Avery stand, as if the air itself balanced on her shoulders, and stayed put. The habit of skepticism gave way to the habit of noticing. He did not need to say anything to know the difference. The wind pressed against the buildings and the flags answered with a slow snap. Range hot held, and then range cold returned, as the tower called a reset. Avery eased the rifle slightly higher on the sling and stayed inside the paint. The rules were simple, and she treated them like gravity. Nothing asked for a speech, and none was given. The work looked small to anyone who did not know what each gesture meant. To her, it was the quiet math in the wind and the shape of the ground. The day wore on and left the tools set for whatever came next. Snow thickened over the yard and trimmed every sound down to a soft hush. Avery Cole stood just outside the painted boundary with her weight set in a patient stance. The rifle rested at low ready with the muzzle down and the safety on. Her fingers stayed indexed along the receiver and never drifted toward the trigger. The range tower called range hot and the flags snapped. Then range cold and the voices answered in steady cadence. Avery did not cross the line because the line was the rule. The Tactical Operations Center issued tasking, and she did not have any. She was a civilian technical advisor with no unit patch and no authority to intervene. Inside the main building, the air felt warmer and the pace stayed measured. Admiral Bennett Shaw kept his presence quiet and efficient as he moved through the day of checks. Lieutenant Noah Price handled message traffic and time hacks without raising his voice. Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney held the Tactical Operations Center net to dead air, unless essential, which kept the channels clean. Outside, the sky pressed lower, and the color shifted toward a flat iron gray. Wind pivoted from west-northwest and began to drive spindrift along the fence line. Whiteout pulses came longer and more often, until the far berm faded and returned like a slow blink. Temperature slid down and made breath sharper in the throat. Avery logged what the weather was doing rather than what it might do. She noted the wind shift, the longer pulses, and the drop in temperature on a small card she kept in an inside pocket. She watched how the snow stacked at the base of the target frames and how the gusts curled under the flags. Her posture never asked for notice. The rule of the installation stayed simple and firm. No one acted outside tasking from the Tactical Operations Center, and contractors did not step in. Range etiquette held with the same confidence as the mountains that ringed the valley. Range hot and range cold were not suggestions, and the motion of people matched the calls. A six-man reconnaissance element sat on a ridge well beyond the wire, and the weather pushing across the compound pushed across them as well. Reports in the Tactical Operations Center came in broken lines and careful words. The signal faded in and out with the storm and with the terrain. No one in the yard could fix the air or raise the ridge. Avery kept the rifle down and the safety on, while the updates moved inside on the protected net. She listened to the rhythm of movement more than to any single word. When she stepped toward a doorway, she locked the bolt to the rear and showed a clear chamber before entering. When she stepped back out, she let the bolt forward on an empty chamber and returned to her place by the line. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh paced a slow path between the armory and the entry and carried a paper cup that cooled fast. He watched the yard with the patience of someone who had lived in these places long enough to let the noise fall off. He saw the civilian advisor who did not insert herself, and he marked the absence of drama as a good sign. The work went on without commentary. Inside, Delaney made sure the net stayed clean for the watch officer and the log. He used time checks and short acknowledgments to keep the rhythm clear. Admiral Shaw stood close enough to read the boards and far enough to let the team work. Lieutenant Price kept message flow orderly and tracked what needed a follow-up without dragging the net. Outside, the light flattened and then darkened as a wide band of weather moved in over the ridge. Whiteout did what it does and erased detail until only shapes remained. The wind built into steady pressure with sharp lifts that came without warning. Cold found skin and made hands feel slow unless the mind kept them honest. Avery used her notes the way a pilot uses a kneeboard. She wrote what she saw and did not guess where it would land. She kept her eyes on the wind skimming across the ground and the eddies that formed behind each hard edge. She let those small signals inform the next small note. The rule about forms of address held its own. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander, Chief, Lieutenant. The respect did not live in the volume of a voice, but in the way actions lined up with authority. People inside the building carried out roles that needed no explanation. Range cold came again, and steel downrange fell quiet. Avery raised the rifle only enough to keep the sling from biting her shoulder and stayed on her side of the paint. She looked at the flag and then at the way loose snow traced the fence base in thin waves. The rifle remained a tool at rest, rather than a solution in search of a problem. Updates from the ridge tightened the air in the Tactical Operations Center. The team out there worked a problem with limited visibility and not much room to move. The weather put weight on every decision and then increased the weight. The watch officer kept the log accurate, and the room stayed professional. Avery did not add herself to the net or to the conversation around it. She stayed in the place where her presence did not create more noise. She took the kind of notes that can become a plan if asked, or can be discarded without loss if not asked. The restraint was not a show. It was the job she had in the moment. Walsh walked past the line and let his eyes touch the muzzle and the safety and the boundary paint. Everything was where it should be, and nothing asked for correction. He moved on and let the cold do what it does to coffee. Skepticism met compliance and had nothing to push against. The wind rose and fell and rose again. The range tower kept the cadence firm with clean calls and clean replies. The yard moved the way a healthy heartbeat moves, when the body is working hard but not failing. Order gave shape to time. Avery rolled her shoulders once to keep blood in the hands and then settled back into stillness. The notes in her pocket were a small stack of facts about air, cold, and drift. She breathed in a pattern that did not draw attention and did not break discipline. Her presence created no new problems. Inside, Admiral Shaw leaned over a board and listened while Delaney summarized. Lieutenant Price checked the clock and wrote down the next scheduled coordination. Respect for chain of command made the room feel stable even as the weather knocked at the doors and windows. Everyone carried the right weight for the role. Range hot returned, and the world beyond the berm went noisy again in short bursts. Avery did not cross the paint. She stayed with muzzle down and safety on, and let the calls run past her. She let the work be the work without adding a footnote. As the afternoon pressed on, the whiteout pulses stretched until minutes felt like hours. The wind from west-northwest hit the building faces and curved back along the ground. Temperature fell another notch and locked the surface into a hard skin. The sky held the light down close, and the mountain ridge took the rest. Avery looked at the clouds, and then at the blowing snow that raced past her boots and vanished. She wrote, wind shift, sustained from west, northwest, and whiteout period extended. She wrote, temperature falling and visibility intermittent. She kept her handwriting plain so she could read it with a headlamp if she needed to later. She did not seek eyes or approval or assignment. She waited inside the rule of observe only until told otherwise by the Tactical Operations Center. She was a civilian technical advisor with no tasking to shoot and no authority to intervene. Patience showed itself as a simple refusal to add noise. Night would come later and make its own choices about the ridge. For now, the compound held to its routine and its rules with the same discipline it used on better days. The pressure in the air did not break anything. It set the stage. Avery stood where she was supposed to stand and let the weather tell the time. Snow pushed sideways across the ridge and turned the world into a narrow band of shapes. The six-man reconnaissance element, led by Lieutenant Jason Carter, lay tight against stone and scrub. Fire reached them from three sides and pressed them flat whenever they tried to look. The weather took the rest of their options and put them away. Back at the facility, the air on the landing pad felt like a hard wall. The flight lead for the helicopter detachment gave a simple answer that did not bend. MH-60 aircraft would not launch in this band of weather. The ceiling, the gusts, and the ice made the risk unacceptable. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney stood behind the watch officer and kept the net quiet. Dead air, unless essential, was the rule, and he enforced it with short acknowledgments and time checks. The log built a clear picture from small lines that did not waste words. Every entry had a source and a time. Communications from the ridge arrived in broken pieces. Singar's transmissions came and went with the wind and the terrain. SATCOM cut in and out and never stayed long. ISR options were thin because whiteout reduced every sensor to guesswork. The first spot reports carried facts that mattered. Contact from three sides at close and medium ranges. Limited movement behind the enemy line that suggested more bodies coming up the slope. The team held position with cover and careful fire. But they were not free to maneuver. Delaney took each report and fed it to the board in clean language. He did not add adjectives or hopes. He noted ammo counts, casualty status, and any change in wind at the ridge. He kept a running clock on when the team would need to shift positions even if the fire lightened. Admiral Bennett Shaw stood off the shoulder of the watch officer and read the board without stepping into the controls. His job was risk at the command level, and he kept it there. He looked for places where policy could bend without putting more people in a bad place. He let the operators run their lanes. Lieutenant Noah Price managed message traffic and kept outside lines from pulling attention off the main problem. He tracked who had been called, who had replied, and what was pending. He set small alarms for time-based checks so nothing slipped through fatigue. His voice stayed even when the board filled with bad news. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh added a line here and there when his experience could narrow a guess. He suggested how wind would roll through that specific cut on the ridge. He noted that snow would drift deeper on the north face and make movement noisier. He kept his input inside his role and stepped back when it was not needed. On the ridge, the fight changed shape as the enemy shifted angles. The bursts came in short, hard runs that probed for a weak edge. The team used the moments between to push water and check weapons. They stayed off the radio unless there was a reason to speak. Delaney put the options on a clean page. Air support was grounded and would stay grounded until a break that would not arrive in time. A ground quick reaction force would need roughly 18 hours on foot in heavy snow over exposed routes that enemy observation posts could see. That option risked loss of the recon team and the relief force. He added the time factor that mattered most. The hostile element was consolidating for an assault with a window around 6 hours. That estimate came from movement reports, the lull pattern, and the kind of math that lives in a watchstander's bones. Waiting would narrow choices until there were none. The Tactical Operations Center worked inside those numbers. A request for artillery died because the guns were not in range for this terrain and the weather would murder any correction. A request for unmanned coverage went into a queue that the weather kept closing. The only reliable feeds were the voices on the net and the ink on the board. Delaney briefed the room in 3 sentences and brought it to the Admiral. He said what could be done and what could not be done. He said what delay would cost in bodies and what haste would cost in confusion. He did not pretend the list was longer than it was. Admiral Shaw listened and then asked for second-order effects in plain words. If a ground force stepped off at once, how many checkpoints would the enemy see? And what would the terrain do to pace? If the team on the ridge attempted a break on their own, how far could they move without crossing more fire? Price marked these questions and waited for returns. Reports from the ridge kept the pace honest. A near hit on the radio filled the channel with a hard pop and then silence. A minute later, the watch officer logged that the set was still working and that breath was still moving on the open key. No one said anything clever. They went back to the work. Walsh pointed to the ridgeline on a paper map and traced the prevailing drift pattern with a gloved knuckle. He said the enemy on the north side would feel braver because the slope would sound dead under their feet. He said the east face would be treacherous even for men who knew it. He stopped before his words became a plan. Delaney called the net clear and ran a time hack for top of the hour. The echo from the ridge came back late and faint, which told him the storm had thickened. He logged it as a condition that would touch every choice. He asked for a status that did not take the team off their guns for more than a breath. The numbers on the whiteboard settled into a shape that anyone in the room could read. Assault within 6 hours. 18 hours for a ground force over exposed routes. Aircraft grounded until the weather stopped being what it was. Probable loss of the recon team if nothing changed. He walked that shape to the Admiral and set it down in words. He did not cry out for a miracle or ask the room to cheer. He said that keeping to the plan meant losing the men, and that trying to push a ground force would likely lose more. He left the sentence at that because it did not need more. Shaw asked 2 more questions and waited for real answers. Could ISR be improved with any asset in theater that did not need a clear sky? Could the team modify posture to pull the enemy into an angle with less support? Price sent the first question out, and Delaney pushed the second to the ridge, at a time when the reply would not cost blood. A small break came in the storm and showed the ridge as a darker smear against lighter sky. It lasted less than a minute, and then the white returned. It was enough to confirm that the enemy was still in place, and still pressing the arc that hurt most. The watch officer put that confirmation on the board. Delaney added the likely next moves in calm language. Enemy consolidation would finish and turn into a coordinated push. The team would have to adjust to keep from being wrapped. Without outside help, the odds turned against them as the light dropped and the cold grew. He held the room on the task at hand. No one raised a voice and no one turned the board into a speech. The Tactical Operations Center kept its shape under the pressure and respected the chain of command. People did their jobs and let the facts guide the next line. Back on the ridge, the team leader burned a quick line through the radio that made sense of the last few minutes. They had found cover in angles that bought time but not freedom. Ammunition was fine for now. Movement remained a bad bet under this fire. Delaney put a thin circle around the 6-hour mark and drew a line to the clock on the wall. He spoke to the Admiral in the same steady tone he used with the watch officer. If nothing changed, the window would close on lives. He left the rest in the air like a weight everyone could feel. Shaw looked at the board one more time, and then at the faces in the room. He saw professionals doing what the day asked with honesty. He also saw a plan that had failed under weather and pressure and would not repair itself. He squared the problem in his head and kept his voice level. Price stepped in and handed up the latest replies. Unmanned coverage remained unreliable under the current ceiling. No fire's asset would fix this without eyes. The answers were clean and hard and left no room for tricks. Walsh gave the last assessment he had in him for the hour. He said the enemy would likely test the team with a rush at dusk because cold turns, brave men, impatient. He said the team would hold if something changed the angles. Then he stepped back to his post. Delaney closed the update with a short statement of facts. The planned surveillance mission had collapsed into a static fight on a bad ridge in bad weather. The team was still alive and still disciplined. The cost of staying with the plan was written on the board in a way no one could miss. The room took that truth and held it without panic. People checked their watches and their notes and their lanes. The net stayed clean, so any change would not drown in talk. Outside, the wind rose again and pressed snow hard against the windows. For the next few minutes, nothing moved except the clock and the weather. The Tactical Operations Center kept breathing in the steady way of trained people under pressure. The dilemma stood in the center of the room like a silent thing. Something would have to give, or the ridge would take what it wanted. Snow pressed against the buildings and tried to get in through every seam. The range tower kept its voice steady as it called range hot and range cold in a measured rhythm. Avery Cole stood inside the line and worked the job that belonged to her without asking for more. The yard felt tight with weather and with the kind of worry that does not show on faces. She walked to the casualty collection point and checked what would matter if things went bad. Med kits opened and closed with clean seals. Warming blankets were folded so they could be pulled with one hand. Litters and hypothermia wraps sat staged where any team could grab them without a search. The air bit at fingers and made fast work clumsy if the mind wandered. Avery kept her breath slow, and even so small tasks stayed small. She checked time hacks against a mental loop and did not let the cold rush her. Her posture read calm without a hint of slack. She moved gear near the range, but did not step across the paint. The line was the rule, and the rule kept people alive. Staged bundles sat on a cart with straps laid flat and free of twist. The handles pointed the same direction, so anyone could move them without thinking. Back at her position, she brought the rifle up in a slow arc and set it belly down on a mat. Accuracy International, AXMC. .338. Lapua Magnum. Suppressor mounted and timed. She marked the zero stop and ran the turrets to verify the hard return. The crown and baffles got a close look for carbon or frost. Magazines came next. 6 10-round boxes laid out where her gloved hands would find them in the dark or in whiteout. She loaded with care, feeling each round seat, then tapped each mag against her palm for a tactile count. A gentle tug after each insert confirmed positive lock. The Trijicon Snipe IR clip on thermal got a battery check before anything else. Cells read strong and contacts were clean. She mounted the unit and ran a quick alignment verification against the day optic. Point of impact needed to stay the same in the real world. Not almost the same. She pulled a waterproof card and wrote fresh data for holds from 700 to 1,000 meters. The writing stayed simple and large enough to read under a headlamp. Win numbers had their own box, so she would not chase them across the page. The card slipped back into the pocket where body heat would keep it readable. A Kestrel 5700 slid out of another pocket and woke into the cold air. She let it settle before logging a new wind update and pressure. The screen gave her the truth she needed. She recorded the numbers, saved the profile, and did not broadcast anything on any net. The range tower called range hot again, and the flag snapped against the poles. Avery kept muzzle down and safety on. She rolled the sling snug so it would not bite later when arms were tired. The bolt stayed forward on an empty chamber until a tasking said otherwise. Inside, Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney kept the Tactical Operations Center disciplined. Dead air, unless essential, held the net steady for the ridge. Admiral Bennett Shaw stood where he could see the board and the room without taking the watch officer's chair. Lieutenant Noah Price handled message traffic in time and kept answers moving to the right places. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh watched Avery for a moment when the door swung open. He saw the way her hands moved like there was more time than there was. He noted that nothing rattled and nothing flashed. Then he let the door close and went back to his lane. Avery ran the bolt and felt the travel like a small clock. She pressed through the trigger wall on a dry check and watched the reticle settle instead of jump. She looked once more at the suppressor to confirm alignment and shoulder. Small problems die under this kind of attention. Range cold came with a clean call and a pause that felt like a held breath. Avery lifted the rifle and stepped toward the door with the rest of the line. At the threshold, she locked the bolt to the rear and showed chamber clear with a glance and with touch. The range safety petty officer nodded, and she moved inside. The hallway felt warm and full of wool and coffee. A corpsman carried blankets toward the aid station, and a junior officer hurried past with a notebook held tight. Forms of address kept their shape. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander, Chief, Lieutenant. The words gave the place its rails. Avery returned to the yard when the call sent her back. She set the rifle on the mat again and checked the screws that mattered. Scope, base, rings, bipod. Each got a brief touch and a feel for movement. Nothing moved that should not move. Her breathing cadence stayed even and slow, so fingers would not get ahead of the rest. In for a count. Hold. Out until the chest felt light. Then in again. She did not speak unless someone spoke to her. The quiet kept noise out of the work and left room for detail. Delaney's voice came clear on the internal net and kept its shape. He used time hacks and short acknowledgments to protect the channel. The watch officer wrote with neat lines and did not lift his pen when the room got loud. Admiral Shaw asked the kind of questions that change outcomes and waited for the right answers. Avery ran one more check on the snipe IR alignment because repetition saves time later. She looked for any drift in point of impact and did not find it. The reticle stayed where it should when she worked through the trigger press. The thermal slid off the rail and back into its sleeve to keep the glass warm enough to matter. She added a second data card with holds for wind at 2 values that matched the Kestrel bracket. Cards were cheap. Seconds were not. A pencil line marked the current air density, and a small note reminded her where the last gust sat. The card went back into the pocket where it would not crack. Walsh moved past again with a cup that had gone cold. He watched her tap the base of each mag and seat them in the pouch with the same orientation. He looked at the sling hardware and the way the webbing lay flat. He did not say anything. The picture did not need words. Avery kept her voice minimal when a range safety petty officer checked on staging. She gave the answer that solved the question and left it at that. Her hand stayed steady because steady habits had been built one cold day at a time. She looked at the flag, felt the wind on her cheek, and wrote a small note about the shift. The yard carried a low noise of work and weather, while the Tactical Operations Center carried the weight of the ridge. Avery felt both and let both pass through her without grabbing at either. The rifle was ready because it might need to be ready. The gear at the casualty collection point was ready because someone might need it first. Range hot returned and spread down range in short cracks and thumps. Avery did not cross the line. She kept the muzzle down and the safety on. The sling sat where it would ride without biting or slipping, and the stock felt like a familiar tool rather than a trophy. She did not look for attention or tasking. She did not try to help by talking. She helped by leaving no job half done and by leaving no gear unmarked. If a tasking came, she would be ready. If it did not come, nothing would be lost. Inside, Delaney held the net steady while Admiral Shaw watched the clock and the facts. Lieutenant Price pushed messages to the right circuits without stealing focus from the main problem. Walsh kept station and said little. The room moved like a practice drill under real weather. Avery checked time on the watch face and converted it to the loop in her head. She did not hurry. She did not stall. She made the next small check and then the next. The pattern turned noise into work and work into readiness. The wind rose. The snow pushed harder. The ridge held the team in place and would not let them go on hope. Avery stood inside the line with tools that were ready and a breath that stayed steady. Calm work in a loud hour was the only thing that made sense. The Tactical Operations Center held a calm that felt earned by practice. Screens gave a muted glow, and the whiteboard carried short lines that told the story without drama. Snow scratched at the windows in steady bursts that matched the gusts outside. People stood where their jobs lived, and let the work guide their posture. Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney drew a finger along a topo and stopped on a northwest peak that looked like a blunt tooth. The distance from that peak to the enemy positions around the pinned element sat near 950 to 1,000 meters. Line of sight would clear the intervening folds if the shooter took the upper rocks and stayed tight to the lee. The wind would fight, but the angles were real. Avery Cole stepped in at Delaney's nod and stood with a quiet set to her shoulders. She looked at the topo for 30 seconds and let her eyes climb and descend the contour lines. She checked prevailing wind, imagined updrafts off the valley, and felt where the quartering push would bite a bullet in thin air. The call in her head settled into numbers she trusted. She spoke to the room with the same even tone she used on a cold range. One person could make the climb on foot and take a glass position with stable bones. The shot lanes would open enough to read movement and break control if the timing was right. The plan did not need luck if the work was clean. Admiral Bennett Shaw listened without pulling the map away from the operators. The facts on the board had closed most doors and left this one open a crack. He had a duty to risk and the authority to bend a rule when lives depended on it. He asked for conditions that would keep the chain of command intact. Delaney set the tasking in clear military terms that fit real practice. Solo climb on foot with no helicopter launch in this weather. Periodic weather updates every 15 minutes from the Tactical Operations Center to keep wind and pressure current. Strict radio discipline with short acknowledgments and no crosstalk once she was on glass. Lieutenant Noah Price managed message traffic with the same quiet tempo he used all morning. He pulled time hacks and set reminders to push weather at the right minute marks. He lined the calls up so the net would not jam when the room got tight. He kept outside circuits from draining attention off the ridge. Shaw looked once around the room to confirm roles, then authorized an exception to policy at the flag level. He delegated tactical control to Delaney and kept his seat in the lane of command risk. The watch officer logged the decision with source, time, and conditions. No one raised a voice because the moment did not need that kind of noise. Delaney repeated the conditions for clarity and let silence follow so the words would stick. Solo insertion, on foot, to the northwest peak. Weather pushes every 15 minutes. Radio discipline that keeps the net alive for the team in contact. No interference with her fire plan once she was on glass and reading the fight. Avery nodded once and moved to the gear list without flourish. Accuracy International AXMC in .338 Lapua Magnum with a mounted suppressor and a Schmidt and Bender 5 to 25 power day optic. Trigicon Snipe IR clip on thermal for contrast when snow washed detail from the glass. Kestrel 5700 with applied ballistics for true air and wind. And a Vectronics PLRF 15C laser rangefinder for hard distances. She added 6 10-round magazines loaded with 250-grain match ammunition, seated and checked by feel. A minimalist medical kit with pressure dressing and hypothermia wrap tucked flat in the pack. Snow travel gear that matched the terrain. Not a catalog. And a discreet radio with the net plan taped inside a pocket where it would not get lost. She spoke each item like it was a promise, and then stopped talking. Delaney put a finger on the clock and ran a time hack for the room. The net answered back with short echoes that landed where they should. Price made a small mark at the next 15-minute weather push and set another at the 30. Walsh stepped close enough to see the topo and then stepped back to let the lane stay clear. Avery glanced once at the whiteout on the window and then at the board where the ridge sat in numbers. She called the wind in her head and marked where updrafts would live when the gusts hit the face of the rock. She pictured the hold at 950 meters, and the correction if the gust ran higher. She did not ask for more time because the work did not want talk. Shaw said what needed to be said to fix responsibility, and then let the operators move. The exception to policy was his to own, and he owned it cleanly. Delaney took tactical control for the climb and the glass. The watch officer wrote the record that would matter later when memory blurred. Avery checked her gloves. zipped the Kestrel into a pocket where body heat would keep the screen honest, and laid the rifle across her hands like a tool rather than a flag. Walsh watched the small things that show a person has done this kind of work before. He saw calm, not bravado, and the lack of hurry that only comes from long practice. He did not try to help, because help would only slow the moment. Delaney looked at the room and set the last pieces. Movement window starts on his call, and radio checks are limited to essential lines. Weather updates hit the net on the quarter hour, whether anyone asks or not. The pinned element will hear nothing they do not need and will not be pulled from their work. Price pushed a short reminder that read like a checklist in his own head. Battery levels verified on the thermal and the laser. Profiles loaded in applied ballistics with current density altitude. A second copy of the net plan sealed in a pocket that will not tear in the climb. He kept the list inside his job and did not try to run someone else's lane. Avery took one breath, held long enough to settle the heart, and let it out. She picked up the pack, took the rifle, and moved through the door with a steady pace that looked slower than it was. She did not look back because the work lived forward. The room returned to its rhythm as soon as she cleared the threshold. The net went quiet, except for the weather push at the next 15-minute mark. The watch officer tracked time and wrote with the same neat hand. Delaney watched the board and the clock and kept his voice ready but not eager. Shaw stood where he could see the room work and did not step into it. Snow hit the glass and skittered away. The ridge stayed a shape on a map and a pulse on a net. The exception to policy held its form as a tasked order with control and oversight. No one called it brave. They called it necessary. Avery walked into weather that ate sound and let only purpose pass through. The kit sat right on her shoulders, and the numbers lived where they needed to live. She would climb without rush, take glass, and act when the plan called for it. Duty bent a rule with the consent of command, and the work would speak for itself when it mattered. The climb took 4 hours that felt longer than the clock. Snow packed under Avery Cole's boots in a steady rhythm that kept heat in and waste out. She moved along the contour like a careful thread, using wind shadow when the slope gave it, and bearing the gusts when it did not. Breathing fell into a low pattern that matched her pace and kept the mind clear. She kept weight where it counted and let everything else ride quiet. The pack sat high and did not swing. The rifle lay across her chest with the muzzle down and covered. Sling tightened enough to stop bounce without choking motion. Each step was placed, tested, and taken. Wind from the west-northwest curled over the ridge and dropped spindrift into her path. At times, the world narrowed to a gray wall and a faint sense of up. She paused in those moments and counted the gust, then moved as the push eased. Patience kept speed steady, even when the visibility fell to a few yards. She reached the northwest peak at a point where rock broke the wind just enough to work. The view opened and closed in pulses as the whiteout breathed. She used a gloved hand to brush a patch of stone clean and read the lines of the valley. The hide would need to be small, stable, and fast to erase. The hide came together in minutes, not hours. She built a shallow bed behind a natural lip that took the sting off the wind, without stealing the view. A thin mat cut the first shock of cold from the ground, and a folded jacket filled a void that would have snagged the sling. Nothing rose above the skyline, and nothing shined. She set the rifle down with care that looked like habit. Accuracy International, AXMC, in .33, 8 Lapua Magnum. Suppressor, mounted and timed true. A Schmidt & Bender 5 to 25 power day optic sat low over the action with caps that folded flat. She checked screws by touch because metal told the truth better than light in snow. The Trigicon Snipe IR, clip-on thermal, came out of its sleeve warm enough to be useful. She clipped it to the forward rail and aligned it to the day glass with a short dry press that showed the reticle did not wander. Thermal would give shape when snow tried to erase shape. The day optic would carry the fine aim. She pulled the Vectronics PLRF-15C and ranged 3 fixed landmarks. A scar on a rock face, read 940 meters. A bent pine at the far shoulder, read 980 meters. The edge of a shallow cut to the right, read a hair over 1,000. Distances turned into a mental overlay that matched the topo in her head. The Kestrel 5700 came alive in her hand and settled after a short wait. 14-knot quartering wind from west-northwest, with gusts pushing near 20 knots. Pressure and temperature put density altitude close to 6,700 feet. The ballistic profile confirmed a 950-meter solution for a 250-grain match round using a G7 coefficient that she trusted from long days on other ridges. She set wind brackets that matched the gust pattern rather than a simple average. 1 hold for steady push. 1 hold for gust. A quick note marked the expected updrafts off the warmed rocks when the whiteout thinned. The card went back into a pocket where body heat would keep it readable. Her fingers moved through a simple check of the suppressor, crown, and baffles. Each magazine, 10 rounds each, had been loaded and tapped for a tactile count. She seated the first mag with a firm click and tugged once for lock. The bolt cycled with that polished hinge feel that means the rails and lugs are living right with each other. Below her, the world was sound without detail. She let the thermal fill in the missing pieces. Not a cartoon of heat, but contrast and motion that gave away position. The first shapes resolved into a gun team with a spotter tucked in tight. The machine gun anchor sat farther off, with a line of sight that bit into the pinned element. She took the last seconds before commitment to slow the body and set the mind. Breath down to what the shot needs. Heart rate pulled lower by routine, not drama. The reticle came to center without the strain that makes a hand shake. The cadence would stay simple. First, confirms. Second, adjusts. Third, solves. No fanfare and no flourish. 3 acts that become 1 act when the work is honest. The first shot went at the priority spotter. The suppressor cracked like a book dropped on a table, and the rifle settled back into bone. Through the thermal, the form shifted and collapsed. The echo in her hands matched the picture in the glass, which meant the numbers were right. The second shot went into the same lane, with a hold that matched the gust that ran across her cheek. The wind had come up a notch, and she knew it because the snow lifted a fraction higher off the ridge. The reticle settled. Pressure built. And the round went. The adjust cleared the doubt that math alone never clears. The third shot solved the lane by removing a team leader who sat where movement flowed. She did not celebrate or pause. She breathed, cycled, and looked to the next cluster. The cadence held steady because she did not ask it to be anything else. She worked a pace between 10 and 15 seconds per shot. Enough time to read wind. Enough time to keep the gun honest. Not enough time for the enemy to find the angle by sound or flash. Each movement was small and complete. Muzzle flashes in the valley made brief points of reference that the thermal turned into shapes. Movement displacement gave away men who thought they were still. She learned their rhythm as they tried to learn hers. The hide let her stay a fraction above their thought. Command nodes fell first because breaking control breaks everything. She watched how fighters oriented to a voice or a hand signal and took the person who carried it. The machine gunner went when the time came. Because a broken anchor releases the chain. The lane that hurt the seal element loosened. She fired 17 rounds across 3 minutes and 20 seconds by her clock. 15 were effective in the way that matters on a ridge. 2 served to confirm wind edges in the worst gusts and brought clarity for the rest. The shape of the fight changed as the pattern took hold. Down in the white, the enemy tried to find the threat and looked too low. They fired blind into snow that did not hold her. A few figures began to break toward rocky cover that did not help them. Others turned their backs when the machine gun fell silent and ran. She watched for any hint of a second command node and found it by how bodies pivoted at the sound of a single voice. One more round and the pivot stopped. Control leaked out of the formation and left only small islands of courage. Those islands do not last long under patient pressure. In the Tactical Operations Center, the net stayed clean as the pinned element reported contact fading. The words came in, even and short. No one inside the room said what they felt, because that would not help. The watch officer wrote what needed to be written and waited for the next line. She held her pace until the fight turned soft. Then she stopped where she sat, rather than adding numbers to a log that did not need them. The rifle slacked back into low ready, and the eyes moved. Not the muzzle. She gave the world a minute to show if it had a second plan. Silence in a storm has a shape, and she knew it. She listened for fire that meant regroup, and for footsteps that meant push. None of it came. Only the scratch of snow across stone, and the low wind that never entirely rested. She began to undo the hide with the care she had used to build it. Brass went into a pocket where it would not clink during movement. Prints were softened, not erased by force, because hard erasing leaves its own marks. The mat rolled silent and the jacket folded flat. Thermal slid off the rail and went back to the sleeve. The day optic stayed capped. The suppressor got a quick touch to confirm it had not walked, and then nothing more. The rifle turned from instrument to tool to cargo in a smooth line that kept the story small. She eased into her exfil route with the same patience that had bought the climb. No rush. No drag. She timed her movement to the bigger gusts, where the world went blind for a breath. The slate of snow filled the footprints she left before the wind could ask questions. In the valley, the SEAL element began to move with care that matched what they had just earned. Their voice on the net was simple. Contact fading. Movement possible. They did not ask who had pushed the change, because they did not have to know. The watch officer logged the reports and kept the clock. Delaney stood where control lived and spoke only when needed. Admiral Shaw read the board with a face that noted the shape without inviting attention. Lieutenant Price kept time and messages routed, so nothing obvious failed. Avery stayed off the net unless a safety call would be required, which it was not. She kept her focus on snow shape and wind pressure and the feel of the ridge under boots. She took care of what would keep her warm enough to think all the way down. The plan had asked for focus, and it had gotten focus. Halfway off the peak, she paused and looked back through a pocket of clear air. The place where the gun team had worked looked empty in the way a cut looks clean after a careful stitch. No figures gathered. No new muzzle flashes tried to pick a fight they had already lost. The ridge held quiet. She moved again and felt legs talk in the honest way that means the work is real. The pack rode right and the sling did not bite. Her breath stayed inside the pattern that holds the hand steady for as long as needed. The numbers from the kestrel faded from active thought and settled into memory. Back in the hide. There was nothing left to find for anyone who did not know precisely what to look for. Brass gone. Mat gone. Mark softened. A little pocket of warmth cooling back into the mountain. The place became rock and snow again. By the time the light began to flatten toward evening, she had cleared the worst of the slope. She used a line of scrub to mask her last traverse and dropped into terrain that would not hold a silhouette. The wind was still hard, but now it was a friend that covered sound. She let it carry her without pushing. In the Tactical Operations Center, the pinned element confirmed that they were moving toward more favorable ground. Their words were tired, but even the log read like a sequence of measured gains rather than a sprint. No one in the room tried to draw a picture larger than the facts. Avery kept her own facts tight as she eased around a final rock rib. Tool back to chest. Hands warm enough to matter. Steps put where steps would not be remembered by morning. The climb up had asked for patience. The way down asked for the same. At the edge of the last rise, she checked the route behind her and saw nothing to argue with. She let the breath go long and easy and felt the pulse settle. The rifle was still clean. The numbers had been honest, and the outcome matched the work. She turned toward the path home. The ridge stayed where ridges stay. The wind kept its place. The valley began to fill with a lighter kind of quiet that comes when a fight is over and no one needs to prove anything. Control and timing had done what they are built to do. Relief arrived as a low warmth that did not ask for words. The Tactical Operations Center settled into a steady rhythm as the encirclement began to crack. Screens gave a low glow, and the whiteboard carried short lines that tracked gains without noise. Breath in the room moved with the clock instead of the weather. Professional calm replaced the earlier strain. Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney kept the net clean and firm. He set time hacks that landed like metronome taps and protected dead air unless essential. Acknowledgements came as single words, and then silence returned. The channel felt wide because no one tried to fill it. Avery Cole sent her updates to Delaney off the primary net to protect radio discipline. Each packet was small and exact. Wind shift quartering right with gust edge noted. Movement window 8 to 10 seconds, beginning on his mark. Delaney tuned his pacing to those notes without saying so. He gave the team short moves that matched the wind and terrain. The instructions sounded simple because the hard work had already been done. The effect was cleaner lanes and fewer bad angles. Admiral Bennett Shaw stood where command risk lived and did not touch the controls. His eyes tracked the board and the clock, not the chatter. He measured what could break if timing slipped. He kept his counsel and let the operators run the fight. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh watched the pattern harden into something he trusted. He saw the holds arrive just before the shots mattered. He saw the windows open and close with a logic he could feel in his bones. Doubt fell away and did not return.
Move to the objective!
Lieutenant Jason Carter led his six-man element through the new gaps with quiet discipline.
Suppressing fire!
They bounded by
forward.
element and stayed low in ground that hid movement. IR chem lights marked friendlies for night vision and never flashed where the enemy could use them. The voice on the net stayed even as the ridge pushed back. Avery saw the first enemy regroup starting near the west spur. Figures bunched under a break in the rock and tried to build a line. She read the gust on her cheek, held the reticle a hair for the push, and sent one precise interdiction shot. The cluster came apart like a knot cut once and clean. Delaney relayed the next move in a handful of steady words. No crosstalk touched the net. The team slid through a shallow draw and gained 5 precious meters without a stumble. The clock in the room clicked and no one looked up. A carbine went silent mid-bound in a way that told a story without words. The Marine-trained corpsman called a quick status and reached the man with practiced calm. Double feed. Delaney dropped a timed cover interval into the channel that matched Avery's next window. The team held the angle and gave the seconds that were needed. The clearance was simple and correct even in gloves. Lock the bolt to the rear. Strip the magazine. Rack to clear the stack. Inspect chamber. Insert a fresh magazine. And charge. The man pushed back into the line before the interval closed. The net stayed clean, because no one wasted a syllable. Avery watched the second regroup form, near a line of scrub, where the slope hid feet but not shoulders. She tracked the small sway of a leader, trying to pull shape into the chaos. One round at the hinge point ended the effort without drawing attention. The rest broke into small pieces that could not hold. Lieutenant Noah Price kept time marks rolling in a quiet loop so nothing drifted. Weather pushes landed on schedule and kept the wind picture current. He routed outside messages without letting them bleed into the fight. The board stayed readable at a glance. Delaney's voice set the cadence for everything that mattered. He matched bounds to 8-second gaps when the wind gave them and stretched to 10 when the gusts flattened. He shifted smoke by a half beat so it masked the last movement rather than the first. The language stayed calm and exact. Walsh stood with his hands flat on the edge of the table and let himself believe what he saw. Respect formed without anyone naming it. It came from exact holds, clean pacing, and a pattern that others could anchor to. No speech could have done the same work. The seal element threaded into a shallow saddle that swallowed their silhouettes. Avery held fire as soon as the terrain did the job for her. Discipline gave them stealth that no shot could buy. The channel reflected that choice with silence instead of applause. A sudden lift of wind pressed snow hard against the glass, and the room felt it as a single pulse. Delaney adjusted the next window by 2 seconds and kept the plan intact. Carter's men moved when the mark came and stopped when the ground told them to stop. The rhythm never slipped. The enemy probed once more with scattered bursts and found nothing to fix on. Avery let the shots pass and kept her lane clean. She shifted to observation only because firing would add noise for no gain. The best decision in that minute was to do nothing. Admiral Shaw tracked risk as it drained away, one measured step at a time. He did not step forward because there was nothing to add. The job of command in that hour was to let the right people work. That is its own kind of pressure. Delaney closed the phase with a final short instruction that placed the team in dead ground. The net answered with crisp acknowledgments and went quiet. Price marked the time in the log with a line that would make sense a month from now. The watch officer wrote the last distances without lifting his pen twice. Avery sent a last off-channel note that read like a period at the end of a sentence. Wind steady. Windows closed. Hold fire until movement demands. Delaney folded it into his pacing without breaking stride. The team set into a posture that could wait, move, or break contact as needed. The room aligned around that simple state. No push for glory, no drag from doubt. A plan now flowed through Delaney's voice, informed by Avery's discipline, and supported by quiet work at every station. Everyone followed the simplest path that worked, and the ridge finally let them go. The plan grew out of the map and the weather, not from hope. Avery Cole traced a hard line through a shallow draw that ran north of the ridge. The draw bent into a concealed saddle that cut sightlines from 2 enemy positions. It was not easy ground, but it was ground that could hide men who moved well. She recommended a feint on the east spur to pull eyes away. Smoke, noise, and a brief flash of movement would make that side look urgent. The real route would stay inside the draw, where the slope defeated long fire. The timing would carry more weight than any extra gun. Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney kept the net and the room steady. He called short time hacks that felt like clean clock ticks. His voice held a calm that made other voices match it. Dead air, unless essential, kept noise out of the work. Avery sent her windows off the primary net to protect the channel. 8 seconds here when the gust rose and muffled sound. 10 seconds there when the snow fell heavy and wiped detail. She watched the wind play across the ground and built each move on that truth. Lieutenant Jason Carter read his element into the simple part. Bound by element. Stay low in the draw. Pause only on cover to keep the timing clean. The words fit the ground and left no room for confusion. IR chem lights marked friendly shoulders for night vision. The glow stayed faint and angled so it would not wash where it could be seen from the wrong place. Each man checked his partner by touch and by that small light. The team made a quiet line that felt trained and patient. The weather kept closing and opening in white pulses. Snow drove hard enough to erase edges, then fell back to a thin screen. Temperature slid and made breath bite if the body forgot to manage pace. The clock did not care, and the window narrowed as the storm built. Delaney rolled the start on a short mark that matched a lift in the wind. The east spur feint kicked smoke and noise and pulled a response just wide of the true line. Carter moved first element into the draw with the second tight behind. The saddle ahead waited like a held breath. Avery watched the enemy try to make sense of the feint. Figures turned toward the spur and broke a little formation to answer. That tilt made a gap across the real approach. She sent a single interdiction shot to cut a small regroup that might have seen the draw. Delaney passed the next window with 3 words and a time check. Carter used it for a clean bound across a shallow cut that had trapped them earlier. Snow washed the sound and hid their knees as they moved. The far bank felt like safety because it gave them angles that did not exist a minute before. The second element drifted into place like they had practiced it in a dry field. Feet found grip where scrubs stiffened under the crust. They paused only long enough to confirm cover and then tucked in. The net stayed clean with crisp acknowledgments and nothing more. A lift of wind carried noise from the feint to the enemy on the middle flank. Avery saw a small group try to pull order around a leader who raised his hand at the wrong time. One round sent the group back into pieces. She held fire again, because silence guarded the real work better than any second shot. Delaney kept time hacks steady and short. He gave the team a 9-second hold when the whiteout thickened. He stretched the next window to 10 when the snow eased and the gust backed off. His voice did not change because the work asked for even tone. Carter flagged a halt at the edge of the saddle and let his men breathe. IR chem lights winked once as checks were passed in whispers and taps. A corpsman ran eyes down, gloves, and faces for cold that could sneak up and steal a hand. Nothing looked bad yet, but the clock demanded they keep moving. Avery tracked the lower arc of enemy search fire and read it for what it was. The pattern had no brain anymore. It was nervous. Not smart. She let it pass without response, then waited for the next pulse of wind to give them cover. Delaney paired his next move call with a small shift in smoke on the spur. The deception did not need volume now. It needed timing that matched what men expect to see when a push falters. The enemy watched the false lane and missed the truth. The first element slid forward along the draw, staying low enough to erase shoulder lines. The second element used that cover to follow and then folded beside them. A small pause let the group reset posture and reset breath. Beyond the saddle lay dead ground that would break the last line of sight. Whiteout hit hard and turned everything into cold noise. Delaney changed the next move to a slow count that suited the lack of detail. Carter's men felt the ground with boots and knees and let the snow hide them. Every step was placed like a promise. A sudden stop came when a carbine went silent mid-bound. The corpsman was on it in a heartbeat. Double feed. Delaney dropped a timed cover interval that fit the next gust. The man cleared it by the book and slid back into the line before the window closed. Avery felt the wind turn sharp at cheek and knuckle and called a short hold-off net. Delaney trimmed his next move to fit that edge. The team waited on cover and took the extra breath that buys steadiness. The chatter did not rise because radio discipline was not a slogan here. The enemy tried another regroup near a small knob that overlooked the draw. Two shapes leaned into each other like they were ready to lead. Avery sent one precise interdiction round that removed the center of that idea. The second shape lost courage and sank away. The saddle took them in and changed the air. Sound shifted and felt less hostile. The wind softened enough to make the next step feel possible. Carter gave a hand signal that meant pace and posture, not victory. Delaney relayed a final series of short bounds that followed the last fold of ground into full dead space. He checked the clock and made a note that would look simple in the log. Avery held fire the entire time, because firing would say more than they needed to say. Silence made them smaller than the terrain, and that was the point. IR chem lights were clipped and tucked once the men cleared the last visible line. Night vision still saw what it needed to see. No one snagged gear on scrub because every strap had been laid flat hours earlier. The draw that had been a threat turned into a tunnel they had built with discipline. A whiteout pulse hit and tried to wipe the route, but it arrived too late. The team passed into the back side of the saddle and then into a shallow pocket of trees. The air under those branches felt warmer because it held still. The men did not relax. They reset, checked each other, and kept moving. Delaney set the extraction rally point at a modest distance that the team could reach without burning their last reserves. He called the time hacks like clockwork, and the acknowledgments came back simple and firm. Admiral Bennett Shaw watched risk unwind, notch by notch, and kept his counsel. Lieutenant Noah Price logged every step in clean lines. Avery stayed above long enough to confirm that no new group formed with a plan. The valley looked like a patient with a pressure drop. Brave men still moved down there, but they no longer moved as one thing. The fight had lost the shape that kills teams. She broke down her small hide with the same care that had built it. Brass went into a pocket and left no shine. The mat and sleeve vanished into the pack. The stock of the rifle took a last look at the snow and then hung quiet across her chest. Delaney called the team across the last short open space into the rally point. Carter used the window and the ground and did not try to steal distance. All 6 operators reached the marker, ambulatory. Faces pale with cold. Lips dry. Eyes steady. The corpsmen logged mild exposure and dehydration and kept them walking. There was no helicopter. The storm told them that decision hours ago. They moved under cover toward a safer link-up, the way tired men move, when there is no other option. Feet. Breath. Discipline. And the clock. Avery began her own exfil with the wind at her back and the map in her head. She cut her prints where the gust would lift them and left nothing tidy for a later eye to study. She stepped through each choice at a pace that felt like respect for the mountain. The rifle stayed quiet and the world gave nothing back. The net held its shape with brevity and clear acknowledgments. No one used a sentence where a word would do. The room breathed with the men and with the time hacks. Work replaced hope and earned what hope cannot. Weather pressed one last time and then thinned like it had made its point. The saddle faded behind them, and the draw turned into a feature without threat. The feint on the spur drifted out like a campfire at dawn. No one missed it. Delaney closed the movement phase with a final mark that felt like a period. Carter answered and kept his element moving toward the link-up. Walsh allowed himself a slow exhale that tasted like cold metal and coffee. Price wrote the last line in the log and checked the board again. Relief came as a steady weight lifting. Not as a cheer. The route and the timing had done what they were supposed to do. No one said more than the job required. Everyone went home the only way that matters. Together and on their feet. The after-action report arrived the way such reports always do. In a thin packet, with tidy lines that left out anything that did not fit a box. It listed enemy contact in mountainous terrain. Unfavorable weather, with visibility degraded by whiteout. And successful extraction of a 6-man reconnaissance element. It recorded no mention of a precision shooter or a solo climb to a northwest peak. It read like a clear table. Not like the hours it summarized. Supporting paperwork followed in neat order and looked the way the system looks when it runs as designed. Property loss reports documented abandoned enemy equipment and recorded serials, where possible, with a note on disposition. Medical notes captured mild exposure and dehydration across the team. Actions taken. And return to full-duty expectations, pending rest and rewarming. Each line served the record and left little room for story. Admiral Bennett Shaw read the packet in a borrowed office that smelled of coffee and wool that had seen weather. The window rattled in a wind that had finally begun to tire. The Admiral set the pages in a clean stack and looked at the whiteboard notes compiled earlier that day. He chose to keep related files sealed and accepted responsibility for the risk decision that made the difference. He did not dramatize the choice or spread it across the room. He kept his tone even when he told the watch officer that the packet would remain compartmented for now. He understood that risk had a signature and that his held the pen. He also understood that a quiet outcome with 6 men breathing was the only result that mattered. When Avery Cole stepped into the office, the floor felt steady underfoot. She stood where she had been asked to stand and did not fill the air with anything unnecessary. The Admiral thanked her for saving 6 men and used the simple weight of that number as his measure. She answered that breathing people were the metric, not a name on a line. The conversation held to plain words, because plain words can be heard when a long day ends. He noted that the plan had failed under weather, and that lives had been at the edge. She noted that the climb and the pace had solved what could be solved, and that the team had done their part without flinching. Both recognized that discipline was the hinge that had carried the door. A salute from a flag officer to a civilian is not common. The Admiral gave it anyway and held it with the same quiet care he had used all day. Avery returned a small nod that respected the act without pretending to own its tradition. Equals in cause passed each other at a narrow point in the road and kept moving in their lanes. Only the right amount of past was spoken. And even that, in a low key that matched the office. At 19, Avery had taken an army enlistment and earned expert marksman scores on every range that counted. Unnamed, specialized training followed, along with the kind of instruction that left no neat title and no list of certificates. Later, she shifted into contractor status to preserve deniability, which meant no rank, no official kill count, and a personal habit of carving 3 intersecting lines into a contractor-owned stock after each impossible problem solved. Lieutenant Commander Mark Delaney stopped at the threshold long enough to confirm that the command risk decisions had been logged correctly. He kept his voice measured and his posture quiet, because that is how respect looks in rooms like this. He had controlled the net without breaking its shape, and now he protected the paperwork that would follow the day into history. He did his work with the tempo of a person who has learned to leave no sharp edge for tomorrow to catch. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Walsh moved through the building with a cup that had gone cold and a presence that settled things without orders. He recognized the form he had watched on the ridge and let his earlier doubt stay in the past. He checked on the corpsman and the small comforts that turn a rough night into a routine one. He kept out of rooms that did not need him and made sure the rooms that did stayed calm. Lieutenant Noah Price finished routing the last necessary messages and set his tablet on the desk with the precision of someone who has been taught that small habits prevent big mistakes. He tracked the clock and made a note for a follow-up call that would happen at 2:30 p.m. He checked the board for any missing line and found none. He wrote down the decision to seal related files and placed it in the right folder with the right markings. Lieutenant Jason Carter sat for his medical checks and looked like a man who had been cold for a long time and was finally warming. His voice did not rise above the level required to answer questions clearly. He named equipment deficiencies that could be corrected and did not add color to the facts. He did not ask who had changed the fight, because he did not need to know. In the mess that evening, Ensign Liam Park took a seat near Chief Walsh, with the careful respect of a junior officer who knows who has lived long on the sharp end. Park asked about the small carved marks he had seen on a contractor stock, and tried to keep the curiosity from sounding like a demand. Walsh answered that each set of 3 lines marked an impossible problem solved when time and weather had stripped options to the bone. He reminded the young officer that some capabilities sit outside the traditional pyramid, because visibility can kill the very thing that makes them work. The base woke before dawn the next day and began to look like itself again. Snow crews worked the lots, and the range tower called routine lines that sounded like home to people who prefer order. Training schedules resumed with the slight shuffle that follows any night that asks too much. The sky eased to a light that invited motion, rather than survival. A ground transport rolled to the gate just after the horizon began to color. Avery sat in the back, with the rifle between her knees and her pack at her feet. The small 3-line mark on the stock caught a thin band of pale light and then let it go. The vehicle moved on without anyone stepping into its path. Inside, Admiral Shaw took one last look at the whiteboard in the log before he erased the remnants that did not belong in the open. He thought about policy and about the thin space where policy must bend so people come home. He wrote a short note that reminded future him what had been accepted and why. He placed the note where it would be found by the right eyes and not by the wrong ones. Delaney briefed the day and kept it short. Weather had improved. Throughput would resume. And the lesson of the ridge would burn itself into the checklists in a quiet way. He did not claim credit, because credit was not the point. He returned to the Tactical Operations Center and made sure the room kept its calm. Walsh caught Park in the hallway and told him to keep his ears open when the old hands talk about pattern and timing. He told him that one day he might need to make space for a capability that does not fit a roster line. He reminded him that respect in these halls is often shown by silence rather than by announcement. Park took the words as a gift and filed them for later. Price wrapped the last of the paperwork into tidy stacks that would stand up to any reasonable review. He marked the medical notes as complete, with instructions for follow-through. He closed out the property loss reports and signed where he had to sign. The sound of a stamp on paper felt like a door closing in the right way. Carter stopped by the mess long enough to take in hot food and the slower breathing of men who now had time. He nodded to people who had carried their end of the day and then walked on without calling attention to himself. His team would rest and then return to the range like everyone else. That is how teams of this kind repair. By mid-morning, the compound sounded like training again. Boots scuffed on concrete in the way they do when people are early and unrushed. Steel rang far down the lanes where it should ring. Radios carried routine calls that did not taste like fear. At a corner table, 2 sailors and a junior officer traded a new shorthand that had already begun to form. When a drill turned messy, one of them said that they needed a 3-line solution, and the others nodded. The phrase did not appear on a poster and did not become a boast. It became a small way of asking for calm work under pressure. The files stayed quiet. The lives stayed warm. And the base returned to itself with purpose. People stepped into their roles and kept the day from growing teeth. The mountain watched without comment, as it always does. The lessons settled in where such lessons live. Deep and without drama. That night, the wind moved lightly across the roofs, and the lot held its cold without cruelty. Lights glowed behind office glass and then clicked off in a normal pattern. The mess closed on time, and the range flags rested against their poles. The compound felt like a machine that had been both tested and proven. The next morning would bring a fresh plan and a new set of small tasks that add up to readiness. The people here would do those tasks the way they always do. One careful motion at a time. If another ridge asked for a hard decision, the right person would again carry the right weight. The work would again decide what story is worth writing down. In places like this, the line between paper and people is managed with care. The paper holds the structure. The people hold each other. No one has to say much when that balance is right. They can just breathe and continue. Avery's transport followed the road down the mountain and disappeared around a bend. The day folded over the gap she left and went on. Somewhere another problem was building toward its own hour. And somewhere else, a small set of lines waited on a stalk for the next honest mark. Quiet traveled with her the way a tool travels with a worker. By evening, the phrase in the mess had settled into a new habit, and no one pretended it was theirs to explain. 3-line solution meant calm skill under pressure and nothing more. It was used sparingly and without fanfare, and then put away until needed. That is how good language survives. Discipline, precision, and humanity matter more than titles. If you stayed with this story to the end, thank you for the time and attention. What you carried through the snow and the wind was not just action. It was a question about how we choose. It was a question about what kind of person we want to be when the room goes quiet and the clock keeps moving. Here's the first question I want to place in your hands. When the path splits, do you follow orders or do you trust instinct? Both can be right, and both can be wrong. The hard part is knowing which one protects the people you are responsible for in that moment. Here is the second question, and it has a sting. Do you reach for recognition or do you chase results? Credit can feel good in the short run, but there are days when the best thing you can do is let the work stand and walk away with no name attached. You may not be on a ridge in winter, but you have your own fight. Think about the last time you had to choose between doing what was visible and doing what was effective. Maybe it was a project at work. Maybe it was a hard conversation at home that no one else would hear about. I want to invite you to try a small exercise in the comments. Write 3 words that capture the cadence you heard here. Confirm, adjust, solve. Use that rhythm to explain how you make decisions when the air feels thin. If it helps, use this simple template so anyone can join in. My 3 words are followed by a short sentence about where they apply in your life. Keep it plain and human. Keep it kind toward yourself and toward others. If you know someone who needs quiet encouragement, share this with them today. Send it to a friend who is carrying weight in silence. Save this video for the day when your own resolve feels thin and you need a steady voice. Let it be a small pocket of calm when the weather in your world turns rough. To the service members who watch this, thank you for your time, your discipline, and your care. To the families who carry the long hours and the long waits, thank you for your strength. We will stay respectful of operational security and of the privacy that keeps people safe. Names can stay private while gratitude stays loud. For those of you who support from outside the wire, there is a part you can choose today. Like this video if it helped you breathe a little deeper. Subscribe if you want more stories that move with quiet purpose. Turn on reminders so the next one does not slip past you in a busy week. I would love to hear about a mentor who chose discipline and precision over credit. Post a short note about how they changed the way you work or the way you live. Keep details that should stay private to yourself. Focus on the lesson they gave you that you now give to others. If you lead a team, take a minute to think about how you set the tone in your own tactical operations center. Whatever that looks like in your world. Do you protect dead air unless essential, so your people can think? Do you keep your voice even when the room gets tight? Do you let the right person carry the right weight at the right time? If you are on a team, ask yourself what it looks like to be useful when the weather turns. Sometimes it is gear checks and quiet prep. Sometimes it is a small correction that no one will ever notice. Sometimes it is standing still when the rule says stand still. And then moving when the order says move. There is another piece I want to offer as you step back into your day. Results are not always exciting. Often, they feel like clean paperwork, a safe ride home, and a quiet kitchen at night. The older I get, the more I think those outcomes are the ones worth chasing. If this story brought up strong feelings, let them move through you without hurry. Pride in good work is allowed. Relief is allowed. Even the tired sadness that sometimes follows a hard day is allowed. You are not a machine, and you are not alone. When you leave a comment, try to keep the same respectful tone you heard here. Use first names only if you need to reference a person. Avoid locations, units, and details that should not be online. Keep faith with the people who trusted you with their stories. I know that some of you served in the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or the Coast Guard. I know some of you love someone who did. Thank you for bringing your lived experience to this community. Thank you for catching small details and helping keep us honest without giving away anything that should stay behind the door. If you are new here, welcome. The goal is simple. Tell stories that honor discipline, precision, and humanity without turning them into noise. Hold the line between useful detail and harmful detail with care. When you finish watching, give yourself one small task that lines up with confirm, adjust, solve, confirm what matters in the next hour. Adjust one habit that costs you more than it gives back. Solve one small problem for someone who needs a hand. If you want more of this kind of work, subscribe and stay close. New stories arrive on a steady cadence. If you turn on reminders, you will get a quiet tap on the shoulder when the next one is ready. No hype, just the next careful step. To the veterans who feel the distance between then and now, I see you. You are still allowed to be proud of what you carried. You are still allowed to look for new ways to be useful. Sometimes the most valuable thing you offer now is your calm. To the young leaders who are just starting, remember this. Your voice becomes the weather in your room. Keep it steady. Set clear time hacks. Leave space for the right sound at the right moment. If you are going through a hard stretch, keep a small list close. 3 lines that bring you back when the wind picks up. Confirm what is true. Adjust to what is real. Solve the next thing and only the next thing. I want to close with gratitude that fits in a hand. Thank you for watching. Thank you for leaving the kind of comments that help strangers carry their own load. Thank you for taking care with the way you tell a story that touches uniforms and families and memories. Drop your 3 words in the comments and add 1 sentence about where they apply. Share this with one person who needs it. Save it for a morning when you wake up, tired, and still choose to show up. The room is better when you are in it. If you made it this far, you know what matters here. This is not about medals. This is not about speeches. This is about people who do their jobs with care when no one is watching and keep others safe. The last thing I want to leave you with is simple and steady. Discipline, precision, and humanity matter more than titles. What choice will you make the next time the room goes quiet and the clock keeps moving?